Okay, it's my pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker. I was simply blown away when I first encountered Bernd's work when I was a PhD student. I mean, and he takes you on a journey in true phenomenological style, and he opens up new worlds. And I had never seen scholarly writing like this when I first came across it. And it's something to behold. And he moves from elemental, earthy passions to soaring amongst the heavens and the cosmos across time and space. And somehow, in his existential dialectics, he embraces history, culture, Greek myths, and other classical literary references. So of his long list of scholarly publications, I'm not even going to try and list them here, but he's written on the history and nature of human sciences, psychology, and psychotherapy. He's written on lived space of dwelling, boundaries and thresholds. I love that, the thresholds particularly. And I also love his work on eating, passion, and the Dionysian spirit. With his broad, holistic, humanistic vision, I think you'll agree he's a perfect speaker for our conference theme of intertwining body, self, and world. It is my deep honor to introduce Bernd Jager, professor of psychology at the University of Quebec in Montreal.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay. I'll just give you a little run of what I'm going to do, and then I hope I will do that quickly, I hope, and then maybe we can talk a little bit back and forth. I hope we have some time for that. So basically, what I'm going to do is I'm going to question, this whole notion of a psychology that is based on natural science. And that's even the very notion that psychology should be something like a science. I want to just think about it this morning, about what it would be like if we sought guidance not from the physics and from biology and all these marvelous modern things, but if we let ourselves just simply be guided by ancient myths. What do ancient myths have to say to psychology in the modern time? Particularly psychologists that work in therapeutic relationships, who work in therapy. Therapy, after all, is a kind of conversation. We have to think that it's a discipline of conversation, and as such, it is of course related to such conversations as we find in that Socrates entertains with his students. So we are somehow in this. It's interesting to think about therapy helping professions, like in the terms of what do these ancient myths have to say about that. So I started out with the notion about humanism, and then you get involved in the various history, the long history, controversial history of humanism in the modern world, and that would be rather boring, I think, and it's more for historians to do. So I've just changed my topic a little bit to concentrate more on the theme that has been proposed for this conference, which is this notion of intertwining of self, body, and world. This basically, what is intertwining actually amounts to is dwelling. When we dwell on earth, we intertwine. When we are cultural beings, and cultural beings do just this work of intertwining, if they stop, everything becomes unraveled. So we just start with just how we think the question of human dwelling or of human intertwining. It all depends how we approach that question, whether we are principally influenced by 14th or 15th century classical humanism or its contrasting modern variety that gained force and clarity in the second half of the 18th century, and that gave us such marvelous things as the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Cambodian Revolution, marvelous things. So we will contrast it. So I'll go back first. If we see the world from the perspective of 18th century universalist humanism, we come to understand psychology as allied to the natural sciences, and as such identified with the overall direction and purpose of these sciences, which is to explore and ultimately to master a natural scientific universe. We do in the modern time as if there is nothing else to explore in the world except a natural scientific universe. And of course it limits us enormously, and it complicates enormously our idea of research, etc. Because we always think we have to put it in a kind of a context, we have to formulate it so that it will fit within this concept of a natural scientific universe. I want to put that into question. If we follow this proposition, the proposition thus of universalist humanism, we come to think of human beings as forming part of a natural scientific universe, as we do in biology, and as we do in anthropology, and largely also in psychology. And we come to understand psychology in that case as a specialized science dealing with a particular aspect of the natural universe, namely us. Most succinctly put, psychology becomes the discipline that studies human beings insofar as they form part of a natural environment that needs to be perfected and controlled by science and technology. And we as psychologists were supposed to aid in this whole project of controlling and technologizing our world. Psychology is there to rationalize and perfect human beings so that they can live in complete accord with the natural scientific universe. We will speak within that context of a universal and scientific humanism that developed in the second half of the 18th century. So this humanism understood mankind as inherently forming part of this. Okay. I repeat myself here, I just do these things and then I clip them out and put them. So, all right. So this humanism again understood mankind as inherently forming part of the rational scientific universe that had become hidden from sight by the obscuring accretions of religious myth, horror, illusions, wishful thinking, and superstitions. The task of science would be to liberate us from these incapacitating old habits and to make us ready to inhabit the universe. It would become the self-imposed task of this universal humanism to remove the cobwebs of history and to give humanity a clear and unadorned view of the true and ultimate place in a rational and scientific universe. That is sort of the program of that modern humanism. This humanism wanted above all to break with the past, to loosen the grip of tradition and custom, to marginalize and eventually to crush the power of religious institutions, and to promote above all science and technology as ultimate guides to an enlightened humanity. A clear contrasting view of the intertwining of self, world, and other is afforded by what we might call classic or Renaissance humanism, whose ultimate object is not the conquest of a natural universe, but rather that of building and maintaining an inhabitable cosmos. So, within this mode of thought, we do not think of humanity as emerging, we do not think as emerging accidentally out of a single material universe, but as born of the fruitful union of two ontologically distinct worlds. So the notion of a cosmos is always that you have interacting parts. You know, in the old cosmos, you have the notion of in Aristotle, for example, you find the notion of a heaven that is quite ontologically distinct from the earth. And they kind of talk with each other, these two parts. That's the basic principle of a cosmos, that you have fundamental differences between, for example, on earth, it was considered natural, the natural progression would be linear, you know, from one thing to another, whereas in the heavens everything went around and around. It was a very different, Aristotle used a very different study for the heavens than he did for the earth. That of course collapsed with the introduction of modern science, but a cosmos always is a question of dialogue, of two of separate things, of different things, talking to each other. So within this mode, so it is clear that within the context of a universal and scientific humanism, the disciplines of natural science and that of technology will play the dominant role, because after all, the truth, the ultimate reality is the natural universe within that perspective. And so science and technology are our leaders in that respect. They must, and the disciplines of the arts, of religion, and of the humanities are delegated to a minor or even insignificant role. Under these circumstances, psychology withdraws from the old humanism and stands with science and technology in order to fight superstition, remove myth from public life, and work to integrate the human psyche within the parameters of science and technology. It seems if there is to be a question of integration of self-worth and others, psychology is called upon to make sure that it is done according to scientific principles. To contrast this understanding of the rational scientific intertwining with an understanding, it emerges from the and understanding as it emerges from the humanities and the arts. It is a very different notion if we take that. I will have recourse to religious myth. I will just give you two myths. I will seek the guidance of myths of creation to come to an understanding of dwelling. Okay? So instead of using the universe and natural science, I will start with myth to elucidate the whole question of the intertwining of self, world, and other. Okay. And I will seek this the guidance of myths of creation so as to come to an understanding of dwelling, such as it is elaborated by the arts and humanities, so as to find a different vocation for psychology and a different way of understanding the relationship between science, the arts, and the humanities. That's the primary focus. So I will cite two myths of creation. The one we find in the book of Genesis, and the other we will find in Hesiod's Theogony. So one Greek, one of Jewish Hebrew ancestry. I will then conclude with a genesis of a work of art, and show that a work of art also can always be seen as repeating a kind of myth of creation. and we are always in there. When we see a work of art, we see a repetition of what myth of creation talks about. So to better understand the coming into being of a cosmos and to gain further insight into what it means to contemplate the divine and human world, we turn to the creation myth as it is told in the book of Genesis. This extraordinary poetic and profound narrative does not anywhere address questions about the origin of a natural scientific universe, but it tells us in all essential details about the beginning of a human world. The priestly version of the creation myth, such as we read in that book, describes the creation of the cosmos as a rhythmic process in which moments of forceful creative activity, of active dividing and joining, are succeeded by moments of creative contemplation, benediction, and rest. So it is not just a doing, in the modern sense, a making. There's no question of making human beings in Genesis. There is only question, but there is a question of a kind of a rhythmic succession of the whole process. Genesis myth presents the act of creation not as a single progressive movement of making and shaping, but as a temporal sequence that alternates moments of muscular ordering and separating with moments of spiritual contemplation and benediction. You get a beautiful idea of Genesis, one of the most incredible interpretations of the Genesis myth you will find on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And Michelangelo just portrays there in the first panel, he portrays there a very muscular God who bustles around and puts things out of the way. I mean, he's just ordering this kind of universe, obviously making it ready for some kind of encounter, which is, after all, the purpose of creation in creation myth. It is like all this muscular stuff is done so that a real meeting can take place. Meeting between human beings and maybe eventually between heaven and earth. In that sense, creation, the first part of creation, is not very different from what we do when we expect a guest. Usually, you just postpone things, and in the last minute, oh my God, everything looks like in chaos, and you just bustle around the house and with your partner and make a kind of a place so that people who will come as guests, that it's possible to meet, and so they won't fall over the toys of the children or over junk that's left on the floor or on the sofas. So that's the fundamental notion of housekeeping is here. You keep this thing going. You leaks in the roof, whatever. You do all these things, which is the muscular part of creation. So that guests can eventually meet there. Okay. So, in this way, a Genesis story offers a template for human making and creating, in which a time of active doing is always followed by a time of meeting, of encounter. We might put this differently by understanding the divine creative act as always already internally divided between, on the one hand, an active, hands-on, workaday part that can be thought as foreshadowing the reigning activity of daily life, and on the other as a contemplative, hand-off kind of encounter that we expect from it. And so you see that rhythmic interaction, just in terms, for example, in the beginning, an example of muscular active work, God said, let the waters under the heaven be gathered together in one place, and let the land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. So you see him just busy around housekeeping, getting things ready for mankind to appear. Then this period of activity is then immediately followed by the contemplative phase of creation. And God saw that it was good. That is the moment when he looks at it, likes it, and encounters, meets what has been created. Just has a look around. So that is the contemplative side. We might say the first part belongs to the realm of science and technology, the muscular moving, and the second part, when he looks around, is not bad. That is the moment of meeting, of calling forth, like, how's it going to be? And at that moment, that is the moment, we may say, of the humanities, of thinking about meeting, of the arts, of actually coming in contact, of actually standing before a tree and painting it so as to invite it to come forth and to show itself, which only can be done in a hospitable place. So the passage can be seen as spanning the ontological divide between two very different aspects of the process of creation. There is first of all the question of a gathering together into one place, of water and land, an active interfering and coming to grips with an existing order, almost technological. This phase of muscular activity is followed by a second one of withdrawal, in which the creator takes a step backward from his work and bids welcome to what has been brought into being. The second part of the creative act is summed up in the phrase, "and God saw that it was good." And you will see continuously throughout the process, you see that rhythmic interaction of doing, standing back, and inviting what has been created to come forward and to truly show itself. That is, during this phase of working, of activity, we have a sort of vague idea about what the world around us is like, but we are very much concentrated on getting everything in the place that we want it to be. And we are not really in the mood to kind of really look at what's going on. And we're just busy. And if a kid comes and wants something, then we say, just no, I'm working. Just leave me alone for a minute. We don't want this interference. We don't want to look around. We don't want to meet. We want to work. That is the mentality of the sciences and of technology. And then the other one, the contemplation, is the one of the humanities, of the arts, and of religion also. So we summarize what has been said thus far. We come to the conclusion that the Old Testament represents the divine act of creation as inherently of a dual nature and as essentially composed of mutually irreducible parts. So this creation begins as a positive act of ordering and then establishes what we may call a threshold. And we actually could think that the whole notion that actually in this creation story that human beings are not created until God stands back from them and looks at them and evaluates and asks to show itself. That moment of encounter is really the moment at which humanity is born, according to this myth. So this act we must repeat, we do repeat in art and in thought. This is what painters do for us. Painters, keep us, while we are so busy elbowing and doing all kinds of work, we ask the painter to come and show us. The painter asked the tree to come and show itself. This is the root of phenomenology. It's that Husserl always says, die Dingen selbst. He says he wants to see things, but he doesn't want to see just things, count them or, categorize them, but he wants to see the things themselves. And the things themselves is precisely this moment where something enters into the sphere of hospitality and comes forth and shows its demeanor, shows its qualities, etc. So that is a division, a fundamental division. Most importantly, in this story, we see develop a threshold between work, understood as wrestling and struggling with the natural world, understood as a thankful appreciation of the human and divine creative world. It's really the kind of threshold. We can only truly see a tree, a neighbor, a child. We can only see it when we place a kind of threshold between ourselves and the other. That's a fundamental phenomenological insight that you cannot see with the naked eye when you're just working and busying and you're doing this and that. You need to place a threshold to make things actually visible. So actually, you can say that creation myth tells us that creation actually is the establishment of a threshold where you might say, where God says at a certain moment in this creation story, says, I'll take my hands off. I've made something and now I stand back. That is, I establish a threshold between myself and what I have created so that I can have a relationship with it, so I can talk, so we can have a conversation, so we can do something together, so we can regard each other and have a conversation. And that is the basic notion. But as long as you just keep on going, you keep working, you keep improving, in this incredible, ceaseless activity of modern technology, if you just keep on doing that, if you never stop, then you cannot see the world. You are lost to the world, and the world is lost to you. Okay. Let's have a look at, so here we have the establishment of the threshold is really the act of creation. It's not making human beings or fabricating this or that. It is creating this strange distance between ourselves and others that makes it possible both for ourselves and for the other to move forward and to be known, to be seen, to be understood, to be talked to. Let's see how this goes in Hesiod's Theogony. We are told in Hesiod that in the beginning, human beings and divine beings, of course, we're now moving towards an area of polytheism. In this polytheistic world, says Hesiod, in this world, human beings didn't at first know they were human beings. He speaks about mortals and immortals. And he says mortals and immortals, they were all confused. They were all living together there somewhere on Mount Olympus. And they intermingled without distinction at a place called Mekone, which is the Greek name for the juice of poppy. Mekone. Today, we still use in medicine the Latin derivative of that Greek term, meconium, to refer to the first feces of a newborn child. So it's kind of curious. So it is to say as if it were still in the womb at Meconium, where we were all mixed up with gods and we didn't know the difference between anything. These first human beings who freely intermingled with the gods certainly possessed human qualities, but they were themselves completely unaware of these and were therefore unable to develop any of these qualities. It was Prometheus who first became aware of the difference between gods and man, mortals and immortals. And it was he who convinced the entangled mass of gods and man to take distance from each other and to go their separate ways. We may say Prometheus creates humanity by first separating mankind from the gods and then reuniting them in a new and fruitful way that permits the gods to be truly gods and mortal human beings to develop human ways of being. Actually, what happened, if you follow the story, it's a long story, but Prometheus is the first to announce to mankind, to say to human beings, don't kid yourself, you're not eternal, you're mortal, and you should stay together and not confuse yourself with gods. Huh? And so Prometheus separates these two tribes, and then he goes to Zeus. Zeus is our same word for Dios and for Dieu and for God. So he goes to Zeus, and he says, I think my people, the people that he identified with, mortal human beings, they want to separate. And so they make a great feast, and they have a big oxen, and they kill it, and they divide up the meat, and human beings, they get the meaty parts, and the gods get the bones, and etc. So you have this division. The division between mankind and the gods is lived on the level of a dining experience, you may say, where they all sit together to say farewell. I mean, after all, they just don't want to walk away. I mean, you know, you just have to have a party before you leave. So they're having this nice party, and they're eating, although they have a different diet, you know, one vegetarian, no, one for bones and the other one for, but so it is symbolized, the separation is symbolized. And you see in this also that there is a certain sorrow in parting. You know, it's hard. I mean, birth is painful, separating is hard. And the people, and this suffering is made visible in the animal. The animal, after all, is killed. There's blood flowing. You know, there is some death. There is death and suffering, you know, to prepare this wonderful meal that they have. And then this meal, this farewell meal that gods, the mortals and immortals share, that becomes the foundation later for the Greek sacrificial ritual. Huh? The Greeks, in their religious ritual, repeat this death they repeat this separation by killing the bull and then dividing the meat and giving half to the gods, the bones, and the fat to the gods, with some nice kind of spices on it, so the gods can sit up there in heaven and smell this stuff, but participate in this ritual that is played over and over and over again throughout history, throughout Greek history, which is the notion of separation or birth. I mean, we can think about the birth of mankind in that way, which is therefore constantly repeated in their religion. So these first human beings who freely intermingled with the gods, certainly, an interesting description of Aeschylus in Prometheus Bound. He talks about human beings before they were separated, before the threshold was established between them. He says, he described human beings in this way. In those days, before the separation, people had eyes, but sight was meaningless. They heard sounds, but could not listen. All their length of life, they passed like shapes of dreams, confused and purposeless. Of brick-built, sun-warmed houses or of carpentry, they had no notion. They lived in holes like swarms of ants, or deep in the sunless caverns. They knew no certain way to mark of winter or flowery spring or fruitful summer. Their every act was without knowledge, till I came. I taught them to determine when the stars rise or set. This is a difficult art. Number I taught them, which is the primary science. I invented for them, and also how to set down words in writing. And so Prometheus says essentially he is the tutor of humanity, because he taught them their mortality, he taught them their true status. Okay, so now about yes. So he taught them their true. Okay, so we'll say, and he taught them how to build houses. Houses, of course, in all ancient traditions, houses are understood, first of all, as thresholds. House building starts with a threshold, that is, by creating an inside and an outside. And then the rest follows. You might say, building, constructing a house, a cosmos, a life, is essentially putting down this threshold that then grows out into a house or into a life. Okay. Now, something just interesting about an interesting difference between the sciences and technology on one hand, and the humanities, the arts, and myths on the other. The interesting difference is that, well, there are many interesting differences. I mean, it's just, let's take as an example the notion of encountering a new neighbor. How do we get to know a neighbor? We seek to encounter a new neighbor. We approach the threshold that demarcates his domain from our own, and we announce our presence and seek his permission before we enter any further into his domain. Our first exchanges may be about the weather or some other trivial matter, but what we seek most in this encounter is to lighten the heavy veil of anonymity that hides our presence from each other. That is the fundamental move towards other people, to get to know them. That's the foundation of psychology, not of science. To that end, we may offer stories about our family, tell them what we do for a living, talk about our cars or whatever. But the notion of encountering somebody is always showing something of yourself and asking the other one to reveal something about themselves, but always across a threshold that is there and that guards a certain distance and that keeps the relationship fruitful. That is the fundamental of art, of myth, of ritual, etc. It's always a kind of dialogue with somebody on the other side, across a threshold. So, unlike a scientific investigation, which is always penetrating into the life of somebody else, it's spying, it's you tried. I remember as a psychology student, you know, how we used to sit before one-glass windows to look at kids play. What an insane idea. You know, to be completely separated and to be like peeping toms behind the glass, and then write kind of notes. Of course, you're very clever about all these things. You learn all kinds of terms. But what a strange arrangement to get to know somebody. You know, if you think about it. But it is obviously, these were called, you know, observations, and of course they were meant to be scientific observations, which gave them real status in certain sectors of life. So what we see when we talk about the humanities or about art, we always talk about a kind of conversation. For example, let's say literature. Literature makes no sense. It makes no sense to write unless you already unless the author invokes the other who's going to read. There's always a pair in the humanities. There's always a pair in the arts. You paint for somebody. You don't just paint to see things yourself. So there is in the arts, in the humanities, and also in religion, there is always a kind of conversation going on. In science, it's very different. In science, you are busy. You are ordering things. You are improving things. You're making a much better world, a better mousetrap, or whatever. You're always busy with something. You're not talking to anybody. So you could say science is inherently monological. You know, it is my relationship with the resisting nature, and I'm going to push it back, and I'm going to figure out how to do that. And I go to my laboratorium, and I do all sorts of tricks, and I do mathematical kind of measurements. But finally, it's just to penetrate deeper and to dominate more a natural world. This does not apply in human relationships. Unless, of course, I shouldn't be so categorical. There is, of course, something like medicine, and there is something like, excuse me. You know, medicine does not come out of encounter. Medicine is born out of a relationship to a corpse. It's based on anatomy. It's based on discovering what's inside. It is in the beginning, it is essentially people, you know, working in kind of illicitly late at night, you know, doing dissections and discovering all sorts of interesting things about the human body. And that we should not condemn that. That is a part. But if you work scientifically on human beings, that's what you get. Medicine, biology, you know, certain very useful abstractions, you know, which are, of course, highly valued, and we are very happy with them. But that's a very different way of meeting someone, which is the way of we are always so short of time. I wanted to tell you something about, you know, about the creation of an artwork, but we'll leave that for next, because I think it's important to kind of talk back and forth a bit. Huh?
This is where the helpers come into play.
It would be ironic to give a course, to give a lecture on dialogue and just to be talking myself. Okay, thanks. All right.
So if there are some comments or questions, please, if you could say your name and stand up, and yes, Corey.
I prefer sitting down, actually. My name is Karin Dahlberg. I became very interested in, you used the concept of, or word of, threshold. quite much.
Right.
And I was wondering if it has anything at all to do with the notion of in between, as for
Yes,
example,
Buber, yes.
he does. And I'm asking because what I figured from your speech, but you didn't say it very explicit, if I didn't miss it, was that the idea of threshold then, and that's my question, if that is also a way for you not only to relate, but also to escape the risk of ending up in dualism.
I didn't get the last.
I figured that you talked about the threshold as a way to relate between.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And is also an image for you to escape the risk of ending up in dualism.
Oh, I'm not worried about the risk of dualism. I don't know, these are philosophical, I mean, philosophers always worry about it a great deal. Dualism, I don't think there is a danger in two people being together and talking to one another and revealing each other, themselves to each other, whether that be dualism or not. Of course it's dualism, it's a creative dualism, it's a foundation of culture. You know, there is no culture without people talking to each other. And that starts, of course, with, yes. The whole problem of dualism starts when you start with Descartes and you start with this isolated self, etc. And you come into all sorts of problems, and philosophers always are hacking around with these problems. But we have very different things to do. Our business is to understand and to be with people and not to worry too much about philosophers. Yes.
Hi, thanks for your talk. Can you say something, or have you given thought much to, you work a lot on dwelling, and I've read some of your stuff in the past, and it's been a big influence on my work, which is focusing on homelessness and mental illness.
Right.
So could you say, have you given it much thought about the relationship between homelessness and psychopathology, and can
Yes.
you say something about that, please?
Yeah, that's a very interesting. I remember, as a boy, I thought, we had gypsies come through the village, and I just longed to go with them, and to see the world. And then later on, I thought that maybe hobos, at the train station and so forth, that they would have a very exciting life and that they would be able to tell great stories. Of course, most of the people were just sort of drunk or drugged, or you can't really talk. But what's really interesting, homelessness, I think, is a very fundamental illness. I mean, it's a very fundamental. It turns out that if you are homeless, you cannot really understand much about the world, because understanding is always like going out in the world and then coming back home. Bringing, even if you go and see a movie, we can't wait to tell our friends about it and what we saw about it and what they thought about it. Everything, in order for something to be meaningful to us, we have to bring it home. If we don't have a home, we don't have an anchor. We cannot, our stories evaporate. It just becomes a complete succession of meaningless episodes. And there is no history, and there is no embodiment even, of your own life, It's, having a home is absolutely essential to human beings. That's what Aeschylus is saying about before people had homes, they were fools. They were unable to do anything, anything human. So our task always, I would say, in psychotherapy is to bring people home, and that home can be where other people are. After all, we are the people who receive the stories of people who have been to horrible places, etc. And we give them a body. We give them a home in a certain sense that we offer a place where people can bring their stories. And so many times they discover themselves right there when they tell the stories of who they are.
There's a question over there. Right at the end. We started late, so we can have another 10 minutes.
Oh, good.
Hi.
Right.
My name's Rebecca Loy, and I've been doing a little bit of work in a First Nations community, which talks about a very different connection to the land, an intertwining, if you will,
Right.
and a hunting and gathering community. If I just interpret your words, they're foolish. So I'm wondering if you might reconsider this notion of home in connection to the world, and this notion of dwelling, maybe from that perspective.
Right. You're talking about nomadic existence?
A hunting and gathering community, for
Right.
example,
Right.
a farming community has a home in one place.
Of course.
So when people came to Canada, they took their flag, they put it in the land, and they said, this is my place, I'm going to farm here, this is
Right.
my home.
Right.
But for people who have a hunting and gathering connection to the land,
Yeah, I got you.
everywhere is their home. There's no sequestered space
don't
for that
think so.
dwelling.
I
So I'm
don't-
just wondering maybe if you could speak to that
I
a little
don't
bit.
think that it's true that nomadic people have no home. Of course they have a home. And they are related. Many times nomadic people set themselves up at night where they place their tent, etc., according to a very strict schema with their neighbors, etc. That is, just because you displace your home does not mean you have no home. And when nomadic people hunt, when nomadic men hunt and nomadic women gather, they bring it home. They don't just keep on walking, So, that's the notion. Being nomadic does not exclude having a home. That would be a terrible thing, It's just having it in a different way.
There's a question up there right at the back.
Hi, James McGurk is my name. I thought that your paper was really, really very interesting and really inspiring. One question that occurred to me, though, was that what you're critiquing, it seemed to me, in some ways, is kind of like a metaphysical positivism, a view that the only legitimate perspective is a naturalistic perspective. And I think I would entirely agree with you on that. But there's still a question about what the relationship between human self-understanding and natural scientific discoveries is. If you understand what I mean, then on the one hand we can say that from a humanistic perspective the natural sciences teach us nothing. It's interesting in its own way, but it has nothing to do with human self-understanding. Another perspective could be to say that these discoveries need to be integrated and are integrated in the way that we understand ourselves and understand others.
Right. Right. It would be an exaggeration to say that in the humanities we have nothing to do with science. That's not really true. We just must not allow to be completely dominated by their way of working, by their way of understanding and seeing the world. But naturally, I mean, the scientists. You see, I think that the crucial difference somehow is, do the scientists come home? By this I mean, scientists go out and they explore all kinds of things, and they even go to the moon and whatever. But do they at night come home from this labor to live a different life and to enter a different world with those their family, their friends, etc. So it is like, you could say, science is not an end point. You know, scientific discovery is not an end point. It only becomes useful, or it only becomes truly human when it is brought home to the other world, the larger world, in which we are friends, in which we sit around the table, in which we share our stories. So science must serve this larger world. We must not serve that ideology. So you get when a scientist does not come home, or when a scientific theory does not come home, we talk about scientism. That is, now science forms the very basis of our life. It becomes the ground of all explanation and the reason for being. You know, so that is the great danger. The great danger is technologism and scientism for us. But that does not mean that we should not appreciate science. But science has to come always back to the place where we read novels, where we see poetry, where we go to the theater. That's the larger world that science must serve. The world of the threshold. Yeah. Is that, well, I hope I don't confuse you. Yeah.
Sorry to make you run up and down the stairs. My name is Michael Van Man, and I'm a physician from Edmonton, so it's nice to hear my profession coming from a corpse. Just joking. But one thing that interested me a great deal was when you were speaking of a threshold, because for me, medicine is very much about establishing a threshold. As we encountered,
How to do what with it?
Medicine is very much about establishing a threshold with a patient, whether it be a child or an adult or a family.
Right.
But at the same time, that establishment of a threshold can be a problem, because I never actually get to know who I'm with.
Right.
Because I'm always standing across from them in dialogue.
Right.
And sometimes it's about being on the same side of the threshold and coming home together, as you described it.
Right.
So in the environment that I work, which is a newborn intensive care unit, it's coming home and sitting with a parent together and talking about their child in front of us, about what they hope for their child in the future.
Right.
So for me, I see, medicine, I mean, there's a great deal of humanities in it, in terms of the profession, the practice.
Yeah. What actually, the practice, I mean, we talk sort of abstractly, or I talked sort of abstractly about medicine, but actually the practice of medicine is very fascinating, because, of course, when you enter the bureau, the office of the physician, he first treats you, I mean, you are like a neighbor. He says, how you doing? You looking well or not, or what's the problem? He's a neighbor, and you just talk across the threshold. Then, that we learn, then he takes the threshold, we allow both the threshold to go away, and he says, open your mouth, and he goes, and, and so your body becomes, for just a moment, your body becomes a kind of a natural object. And you pay the man for that. You're happy there is somebody who has this knowledge, who can look at your body actually as a natural object. And then after that, our relationship changes again, and he says, oh, I think you have a little bit of this or that, and here's a pill, and then, hope to see you back, or hope you're feeling better, whatever he says. But then you come back to the common, ordinary world of meeting. There are doctors, like especially in specialists, it becomes more and more difficult, because they just have only a relationship with this abstract biological body. But actually, a good physician has to straddle these different disciplines, and be both a good host who knows how to behave well across the threshold, and a specialist.
We have time for one more question.
Okay.
My name's David Carless. Thank you. I enjoyed the presentation also. My question was very similar to the one you just had, but from a researcher's perspective, in psychologically orientated research, it seems, in my experience, that often the problem is a lack of immersion or too much distance, a bit like the description of the window watching the children play. So I was interested in what you might say about that,
Right.
in terms of the threshold idea again.
Right. But you're basically talking about the difficulty of integrating natural science perspective and integrating that into a real relationship, and that is challenging. But that's the task of the physician, to learn how to straddle the fence, so to say. He just has to see you as a close neighbor, and maybe as a friend even, and then he has to see you also as somebody whom he can cut into if he has to. It's you probably have the same. You have probably the same dynamics in other, but medicine makes it clearest, you see. And so there you have this interesting dialogue between the nurse and the doctor, which is where the nurse embodies the more human dimension of interrelating, and where the physician more takes the pole of science and of activity and of doing something. This is very interesting also in end-of-life sort of medical care. That there comes a moment when the physician has to say, sorry, there is not much I can do anymore, and still then not slink away as you sometimes see. The physician becomes embarrassed because he can't do anything anymore. And so he breaks often the relationship with the patient because he's just embarrassed. He can't do anything anymore for the patient, he says, and therefore it's kind of useless to continue the relationship, which is not true at all. There comes the patient now needs another facet of the physician's life. He needs another facet. He needs him more as a neighbor and a friend, and not as an expert.
Bernd, we're going to have to end it there.
All right.
I, on behalf of everybody, can I
All
just
right.
thank you?
Thank you very much. Thank you.